everybody, welcome back to the Consummate Athlete Podcast. I'm Molly Herford. I write about all different kinds of movement, particularly cycling and running, over on theoutdooredit.com and plenty of other places on the web and in various athletic magazines.
And I'm Peter Glassford. I'm a registered kinesiologist and endurance coach. I am based in Ontario, Canada, but we are all over the place, although very pleased to be back in the general Ontario area for a while here right now.
Yeah, we actually had a pretty exciting weekend. We had our lovely friend Ellen Noble come up from Massachusetts right off of Cyclocross Worlds. I think she was home for about 2.5 days before she came up because it was Joyride 150, the BMX bike park here near Toronto. They had their women's weekend this past weekend. So she came up for that. So she and I got to shred some BMX. She shredded a lot more than I did. We also got to talk to a bunch of women, and we did a big training, nutrition, women's awkward and race issues and all different kinds of stuff chat. That was super fun to do.
It was great to have Mark and Leslie, who run the Joyride 150 bike park, are some of the nicest, hardest working people I know.
Yeah.
And you can say that about people, but if you've ever met Mark and Leslie, they definitely have done a lot and are doing a lot. And so this event was 150 women. There's moms, there's people who've never been on bikes, there was triathletes, road cyclists, mountain bikers, and then people that had a bit of even BMX jumping experience. All just there to sort of get better at riding. And the weekend's pretty free form, but they basically pull in every, instructor, coach, experienced rider, ideally female, but a few male coaches such as myself were there.
So they let you in
to help out. And they just try and pull in the whole community's part of it. And, it's just a really good, my favorite thing is just how community oriented it is. It's just, for the participation and social aspect. It's an amazing event.
Yeah. This is the 7th year that they've run it, which is crazy. Mm-hmm. So props to them for doing it. If anyone is visiting Ontario or lives near Toronto, Markham specifically, please check out Joyride 150. Even if you don't ride BMX, if you think it sounds terrifying, I assure you there is no one more terrified about this kind of stuff than I am, and I love it there. I had so much fun. And
I was pricing it out, so a 3-day pass, 69 Canadian dollars. That's important. Canadian.
You Americans have to come up.
Right, and you can fly. We have 2 airports in Toronto. We have the City Centre Airport, and then we have Pearson, and I don't know what it is to fly from wherever you are. That would vary, I'm sure. But you fly in, take an Uber, you can rent a bike there, or you can bring your BMX in a golf bag or small satchel, and away you go. So
yeah, so much fun.
If you're training for any sort of cycling, you should go to Joyride.
Yeah, and this week I actually got on the trainer and did workouts. Can we just talk about that for a second? I feel like it is kind of relevant to today's topic, so I just wanted to brag on...
it is and it isn't. With one workout in the month, I don't know if that applies.
2 interval workouts. That's more interval workouts than I've done in probably 2 years.
Yeah, and so I guess that does dive us in. Today we have Steve Neal, who's another coach. He was my mentor and also my coach earlier in my career, and he's based in Toronto. He has the cycling gym, and they have an online membership that you can join, and then also they have a cycling sort of studio / strength gym right in Toronto. So
yeah. Some people might remember him from last year. We had him on about a year ago now.
Yeah, one of our most popular episodes, and I think it was just Steve and I talking about coaching and stuff a little bit. But this episode I'm trying to do a couple short episodes. We're approaching our 100th episode. So I wanted to try something new for you guys and mix it up a little. So we're trying to do 20 minutes, one question, which always turns into many follow-up questions and is always rushed. But 20 minutes where it's like a bite-sized concept, and we're going to miss things is the reality. But trying, sort of dive into a question we've got from you guys who are listening, and just try and do it some justice, and or a concept that we've been doing, and get sort of a person's experience with that, how they're applying it. So for this episode, I wanted to go polarized versus threshold training. We've had Marco Altini from HRV for Training talk about 80-20 and the polarized side of training, and then we've also had Stephen Seiler, who's done a lot of the research or been part of a lot of the research on polarized training. So this idea of training really easy or really hard. But we had a couple questions about, how do we come to terms with that versus threshold training? Everyone talks about threshold, this moderate training. how do we come to terms with that, and who does it apply to?
Yeah, it can definitely get a little tough because, I mean, it's kind of comfortably uncomfortable to ride in that weird middle zone that everyone kind of loves to hate.
Yeah, so it's
not super helpful
it's a
for your
deep
training.
Yeah, and so the idea is, you're time limited, and on that we've had Jim Rutberg on talking about time limited, time crunch training for cyclists, their book, which a lot of cyclists really like. And so it's often never, or it is never either or, only this, but it's when do you apply it. So Steve today is not necessarily going to give you the answer, but he speaks a lot to how he applies it, and he's applying it with 60 plus people in a gym that he sees 1, 2, 3, maybe more times a week. And he's generally has great success. The man is quite successful and quite smart with what he does. And so he's been tracking the progress that people have been doing, and he's doing a lot of more middle ground sort of tempo training. And that's what I came up doing. But he also understands, endurance versus threshold versus, VO2 or high end. So
I think this conversation really comes down to, we might know what's going to work the best for an elite athlete that lives in a bubble where they can train perfectly, or, we can really work on those training conditions. But what about the average person who has a hard time hitting that threshold and staying at it?
Well, and that was Steve's point, right? Was that a lot of people aren't able to, especially frequently, to go in and train 3 times a week, even to actually hit what is threshold, that really hard race pace, that 5 or 10K running pace is quite hard. You have to be mentally pretty driven. I've just finished a threshold block, and it's tough. So
especially, I mean, then you factor in you had a tough day at work, you had a, rough night of sleep, anything like that, the lifestyle factors that kind of, impact the average person more than, the pro. It can be really hard to do those proper.
Mm-hmm. So I think the way we came down is this is sort of like this is what he's doing right now. We talk about a couple different examples of where it applies and doesn't apply and stuff like that. But the answer is that it's both, and you need to sort of periodize that and plan that into your season based on the limiters that you have. This is where having a coach helps, is that you can sort of diagnose when are you not following this like normal periodization, this base build, and when do you have to do actual, intensity in the winter or something like this.
Yeah, if you're new to the show, again, go back and listen to the Steve Neal one originally, but also really listen to the Steven Seiler one, because he also talks about periodization on both the macro and micro level. And
that's a great point, that what Steve and I are talking about often gets into more of the micro or the meso cycle, so the week, the day, the week, the month. But the important bit that Steven Seiler drove home was that the polarized studies and the whole concept of 80-20 is really like a annual or 4-year, an Olympic cycle with elite people. So we have to be careful applying that to like our day, right? Or our week even. I just did a threshold block that had a ton of threshold, but my year is a ton of just endurance, like quite easy. Mm-hmm. So you have to be careful not to get caught in that. And I think that's the main message, is really just not riding moderately hard all the time, I think. But
yeah.
That's my opinion. So
yeah,
give it some try. And if you guys have someone else you'd like on, I know we've had a couple suggestions that I'll try and get some other coaches on and how they use it. But if you have any suggestions, or if this makes you really angry or whatever, and if you like this 20-minute format, we'd love to hear that too. And, even a different question with a different person not related to this.
I think it might be over 20 minutes now, Peter.
Could be.
Anyway, enjoy this and check the show notes for links to all the past episodes that we've talked about in this intro. Thanks, guys. Enjoy Steve.
What is polarized training to you? What is threshold training to you? And how do you come to terms with that in your own practice, with the people you work with?
So I think if we talk about polarization, I think the first training intensity that I would take out of the mixture to try to come up with the split is threshold training. So if I was going to look at polarizing someone's training, and I'd almost say almost no matter how much time they have, and this is the tricky question with all this FTP dead stuff on the internet, but let's just currently use everyone's stuff that they talk about all the time. So the first intensity I would take out would be threshold training. So let's call it anything within 10% of FTP. And for lack of, I'd probably even say everything plus or minus 10% of FTP. So, looking at like 3x10s, 3x12s, 3x15s, all done at 5% below a person's FTP, or over-unders or under-overs done just under, just over, whatever you want to call it. But basically, I would remove almost all FTP training from the polarization.
Right. So that's our zone 4, 20 to 60 minute type efforts. So, that's, like you say, that's most Sufferfest, most Zwift, most online stuff. I only have an hour to train. So what do you mean I'm not going to do that?
Yeah. So I would say I would use everything else. I would use recovery, endurance, tempo. I'm probably just VO2 max stuff. Could talk about getting into anaerobic capacity and all that stuff, but I don't really think that people that have not much time have enough base to survive much on anaerobic capacity training all the time. Plus, in order to do it properly, it's really hard, and most people don't want to work that hard. So they think they do until you show them how hard it has to be, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, I can't. That's really hard, and I definitely can't do that 2 or 3 days a week. So if I would probably use sort of VO2 max training, and that's going to depend on the person, right? But like 15-15s or 30-30s or 1 minute on, 1 minute off, or 7x3 or 5x4, you can, go on all day, but it really depends on the person's fitness level and mental capacity as to how long those can be for them. But I would also try to get a person to do 1 hour blocks of tempo. So like, you and I have talked about this at great length, but if someone knows their tempo ability, or they've had a test done and they might happen to know their balance point, or they've used a Moxie to find zone 3 accurately, a really good if you warm up for 10 minutes and ride at your balance point or just under it for an hour, is not an easy session. And if you look at how many kilojoules you can burn doing that, you can do a fair bit of work. And I find it much more repeatable day after day for people. There's the boredom factor, but there's Netflix and Crave for that. But the mental capacity to continue hard intervals all the time kind of gets tricky for people, I think, once they actually try to do it for a while.
So you're suggesting, this would be similar to like a MAF-based training system, or, anyone who's done VO2 would be like max fat type of thing, right? So it's like a low zone 3, high zone 2 type effort. And that's how you maybe get around that time crunch, is riding your endurance a bit harder.
Yeah, so you're breaking up a little bit, so just,
okay.
I'm not sure, but so far so good until the last sentence. But anyways, the thing about math by the equation is a little bit easier than tempo. So if we talk about something that most coaches would talk about, tempo training is not threshold. Tempo training is below it. So therefore, I'd say math is hard endurance, and I'd say tempo is tempo. So if you're referring to like doing your endurance a little bit harder, sure, I'd call that tempo. But I think if people look at their own, even if they have a power meter by chance and they look at some intervals and they do some really hard, if they do a threshold workout that's pretty traditional, like 2x20 or 3x15 or whatever, that has its place in training, I think if they try just 1 hour at tempo, they're going to see that they can do as much or more work muscularly, but they can probably do it 3 days in a row or 4 days in a row. So I find that people who follow a lot of FTP training and do stuff like, Sufferfest is actually different, but Trainer Road for sure is a lot of threshold work. And we get people at the gym who've tried it, and I know that a lot of threshold work just makes them tired. Most people who get into this world they've really adapted to, doing erg mode workouts, and they've got a power meter, and if they're on Trainer Road, then they're just sitting at a certain wattage for their 2x20s. And I think what happens is, as training blocks go onward, we get more tired, and therefore if we're just holding a fixed wattage and not adjusting it down per se, that's how people sort of start to overtrain a bit.
Right. And so how do you come to terms with that, like in a class setting? Like, are you guys doing, really short stuff to keep people excited, or are you doing more of this tempo stuff at the cycling gym?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of tempo here, and a lot of really low RPM work, like 40 to 55 RPM work. Some of that's as hard as a person can push for a certain duration. So, quick example, like, are we getting too far away from your question of polarization? Or are we still on it?
I think we're still on it, because I think what we're trying to go is, like, how does the normal person, whether they're at home on Sufferfest or at a spin studio, like, how do you come to terms with this? Should I just do endurance all the time versus should I do threshold all the time because I'm time crunch? So it fits.
Yeah. So like, keep in mind the gym, people in the gym, I'd say 80% of our people from September through end of March, they only come to the gym and they don't train outside the gym. So therefore they're doing 2 hours on Saturday and they're doing 2 1.5 hour cycling classes, which is 3 hours. So they're doing 5 hours a week on the bike and 2 hours a week of strength. So they're only training 7 hours a week. And, in the last 3 months, we've done, let's call it 2 months of training where 1 day a week we do these, 2 minutes sitting at like 45 RPM, 2 minutes of standing at 45 to 55 RPM. And we might we started at 4 minutes and we worked up to 8. And we never do more than 2 intervals in a thing. So it might be 4 minutes of hard effort, which is a very broad spectrum. But at that RPM, it's generally 85% of a person's MAP, which would be threshold, and up to 110% of a person's MAP, which is above, which is in a VO2 or above. Yeah. Now, this is very RPM dependent. At 45 RPM, people can generate a lot of load without having their heart rate get too high, and they seem to recover from it very quickly. So we've been doing a lot of really low RPM work and then followed immediately by tempo, by heart rate. So the more a person can push, if they have a weaker aerobic system, when we do our 20 minutes of tempo right after that, so we do 4 minutes of hard, low RPM work, followed by right away 15 minutes of tempo. That tempo is restricted by 84% of the person's max heart rate. So therefore, if they haven't recovered from their push, they don't get to push too hard in tempo.
Right.
And we took that upwards to 8 minutes of low RPM work and 30 minutes of tempo. So that was like a 2-month progression. And then Saturdays it's endurance. We do this, I don't know if we talked about it in our last podcast, but basically we still do it quite a bit. We always start off with a ramp test to about 80 to 85% of a person's max heart rate. Then we recover. And then we'll spend a good chunk of the Saturday class doing hard endurance, which is kind of as high as a person could, which is more like math. And we do 10-minute blocks, and they stop and they recover to 60% of their max heart rate. If it takes under 60 seconds, we add 2 minutes to their on time. So each individual's doing more longer sets of endurance on Saturday based on how they recover from the previous one.
Right.
But Saturday's an endurance, full-on endurance session for sure.
So what does, I wanted you to go down that sort of class thing, because it's a general thing in some ways, because you have a group of 50 people that you're working with there, but you're customizing it, and you also said the word, you planned it out and progressed that low RPM. So I think what gets missed in this polarized versus threshold, if it is indeed versus, is that planning or periodization of, it's not necessarily anything bad, but what do you need as an athlete, and what did you do last time? What did you do last week, right?
Yeah. So, our it's a if I just do like if in our biggest week we had, because when they do tempo, it's tempo or it's endurance, because if their heart rate's high from the previous effort, then it ends up being actually not that hard, right? So if we had 8 minutes in our biggest week and we did 3 sets, 24 minutes of work, right? And divide that by 5 hours times 60, 300 minutes. So if we did 24 minutes of work in 300 minutes, it's it's like 0.08. So that's like a 92-8 split polarization.
Right.
And that's very little even. So it's like 8% of the training, right, is at threshold or above.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd say we could arguably split it in half. Probably 4% of it was at threshold and 4% of it was at VO2, and the rest was endurance.
Right.
And there's some tempo in the mix, but not much. So I think the difference, I guess, in what we're trying to accomplish with the limited time is just because you have more time doesn't mean you get to go harder. Because if you go harder, you can maybe do it for 3 to 6 weeks, but then your 90-day progression is going to be a flat line. And I want everyone's 90-day progression to be between 10 and 15% better.
Right. And I guess I guess would an analogy be, we could go into the gym and lift weights, but if, suddenly we only had half an hour, would we just start doing, a cardio circuit with 10-pound weights, or would we, pick the couple things we're going to progress, right? So I guess by similar token, like you and I are going to train for a mountain bike race. If I have 20 hours and you have 10, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to just go do, a little circuit or something like this, right? Or a moderate thing. Like you're still going to focus on those key elements of the sport.
You're bang on. You and I both have to go race a mountain bike. I'm just going to go slower than you because I don't have as much training, but I still have to work on my tempo ability. Like,
well, and your 2 and 4 minute low RPM hill repetitions, right? Like ultimately what you guys are practicing is a hard mountain bike climb, right? Yeah,
or a hard. Yeah, you're right. It's a hard bike climb, and I find that if I go away, my last few years has been full of limited training or none, and so I did single track 6 last year, which was. I have to be careful what I say on this, but I'm never that careful. So there were like 4 to 5 hour days, right, for me, and I have a power meter. Still always look at my stuff, and my goal was to normalize 200 watts a day. And it was all about nutrition and pacing and, walking if I got a bit too deep at times. But, on like on basically no training and being sick, I was able to finish every day of the stage race reasonably well. And there was 3 guys from Trainer Road there that I know are younger than me and that I'm pretty sure ride their bikes. And none of them finished every day of the stage race. And the days of the stage race that they did, they only beat me on the first 2 days. I beat them the rest. So, anyways, I just said it. So if you need to delete that, go ahead. But the bottom line is that they had this amazing successful podcast series after that, talking about all the mistakes they made. Right. In which I think coaches of their level shouldn't be making those mistakes with their own bodies. But with Lyme disease and no training, I beat them with the kind of training we're talking about. Some low RP. None of my workouts are longer than an hour.
Right. And for those races, especially the tempo, just going all day, like what is the fastest pace you can sustain without fatiguing? Like that's definition of tempo. That's, and then nutrition and pacing and not getting your ego in the way. And interesting.
But you're right. So you're bang on. You need to train for the sport. And if you don't have enough time, that's a bummer, but you still can't, doing 30-30s all the time is not going to help you if you have a 3-hour mountain bike race to do.
So one of the ways I've seen polarized training, like now that they're sort of coming to terms, there's been a couple studies that have showed like, well, best people do some threshold and stuff. And so what they've sort of realized is it's actually, everyone does as much endurance as they can sort of absorb or do. Mm-hmm. And then it's actually the race pace. So you actually see if you normalize it around race pace, it's sort of the time people are spending at or above race pace versus just below race pace. So if you start thinking about mountain biking for long durations or triathlon, what's polarized might actually be quite different.
Right? Yeah, I totally. So the only spot this gets tricky, and we do this at the gym as well. We're trying to advance this at the gym by having individualized stations, but in a group setting. So what we have to do, and I guess you could take this for everyone. So what we're trying to do is, if you have someone who is tired, irrelevant of the kind of training, then obviously rest is simple. The other issue that happens, which gets tricky in a group setting, but would work for your listeners, is if you're an Ironman triathlete and you have some time or not, and you're trying to work on your tempo ability and your endurance because that's where you're going to race. Sometimes our endurance and tempo ability reaches a ceiling because our anaerobic capacities, our VO2 and whatnot, so threshold VO2 and anaerobic capacities have kind of collapsed a bit because we haven't been there. So we can't make our endurance or tempo any better because those other capacities have kind of fallen. So it sometimes, even though as an Ironman triathlete or a long distance athlete, you still have to go do harder training to raise your ceiling, to then go back and raise the ceiling that really matters to you. Does that make sense?
100%. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, that some athletes will, again, periodization, personalization, that would be like your 3 or 5 minute test is really close to your 20 or something like that, would be maybe a sign.
Yeah, sure. Exactly.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of the athletes that end up coming to me are sort of tired endurance athletes who want to go faster in their 100K race, and then you look at it and it's like, well, you can't even barely do CP20 pace, right?
Right.
And that could be preference, that could be ability to work hard, that could be fatigue, right? It's not always just you need to build work capacity. It might be recovery or nutrition or whatever.
Yeah. No. Yeah. If you pretend all those other things you just mentioned are, at least taken care of or thought of taken care of, then I think that sometimes actually what gets people into trouble is periodization. Because if you follow that traditional idea of, okay, we're going to spend the next 2 to 3 months, we spent 2 months on endurance and tempo, and now we're going to spend 2 months on threshold. Like in 2 or 3 months of threshold training, you could run into a roadblock where you're not getting better, so you keep banging your head against that wall, and threshold's actually not the answer to make you better. So like trying to figure out what the roadblock is, and maybe just the higher the intensity the roadblock, the shorter period you have to focus on it to make a change. So you're driving down the road of tempo and you run into a roadblock. Well, if you decide that through Googling and talking to some fast friends that VO2 max training might help you, you only maybe have to do that for 2 weeks as an interruption before you can go back to what your focus was.
Right. We both really liked, that's sort of, I guess it's different than the faster book that we both liked, the running book, Run Faster, but yeah, that's definitely that, like, it's not linear periodization, especially when you're time crunched, that base 1, 2, 3 is not necessarily the way, for everyone.
Yeah, it's almost like the opposite. Like when you are time crunched, you might train harder. I think the interruption is the opposite. Let's say you're going to try to train as hard as you can and still absorb it, right? Because we all want to get better. Well, your interruption might have to be volume. And if you don't have time, then your interruption might be rest. Because if you're getting tired from doing too much intensity and you don't have time to go to Arizona and ride for 40 hours to solve it, well, then rest is it's the only part of your equation that is going to allow you to get better.
Right, which is hard sometimes.
True.
And I think that's, I think the only other point I wanted to make and that I have trouble and I wanted to know your opinion on, we're pretty much at 20, but the takeaway I think is that not every day has to be a quote unquote suffer festival, we'll call it. Right? Like whether you're training threshold or tempo or whatever, like it's okay to just go and ride what we would call sort of steady, classic, honest endurance, right?
Yes, it's just learning to be confident that it's going to work for you. And if most people just don't believe in it or they actually don't try it. But, that's why I guess one takeaway is to get people to look at the training they do and look at how much of that actually gets them the most amount of work.
Right.
If training 5% easier, but you can do it 4 days a week, gets you more work at the end of the week, then it's hard to argue with that. That's probably going to be better.
Right. And even if you look back at the last 2 or 3 months, hopefully you have some sort of log or something, how many times were you sick or tired or had to miss a session or felt, got grumpy on a ride, what would that have been like at, as you say, 5% less endurance intensity, but it happened every day and you were smiling and happy and, those high intensity days, whatever that is for you, went really well. Like what could the next 3 months look like, right?
Totally. So like we're out of time. So your analogy to strength training, I thought you were going to head one direction, but you headed a different one, which was still a good direction.
Thank you.
But I use weightlifting a lot with people who are used to it because they come to our gym or they have a background. But if people have 3 by 20 minutes at 264 watts planned and they start that training and it's like noticeably harder than last week, but they know they can finish if they fight through and barely get to the end, they seem to be able to pull that off. But if they deadlifted, 5 sets of 8 reps last week at 300 pounds and they come in this week and they go to warm up and they get to 300 pounds and they can't pick it up, they don't pick it up.
Right.
Or if they can pick it up and they can only pick it up 5 times, they just stop. They don't pick it up 8 times. But we seem to manage the ability to dig ourselves into a hole on a bicycle, which I think is kind of wrong.
Yeah, I wish we took more of a strength training. I like your, that's a good way to think about any of this polarized or thread. It's just like, are you getting better, on the whole week to week, right? Like, is there more work? The work capacity is a word I use a lot. And, at some point we have to look at that. And it's not all work capacity from busting your ass, at threshold intensity, but, there has to be some sign of improvement.
That I would think is the goal. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we'll leave it like that. Cyclinggym.com, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you guys there's clients you just did a big report. It won't be in it, but I'll mention it now that they just did 50 people, like 97% improvement mapped out. And I think, someone's looking out for you as far as your data and stuff. So if you're in Toronto, if you're near Toronto, you got to go see Steve.
Have you checked out our 7-day healthy kickstart yet? That's our free week-long email series that dives into the lifestyle factors that you may be missing on your way to athletic greatness. Training according to your plan is important, but things like sleep, managing stress, moving more throughout the day, improving mobility, and of course, dialing in your nutrition are all just as important.
Over 7 days, you'll learn about how to make small changes that will add up to big results. No crazy advice or fads, just simple reminders about how to optimize your life to improve your training. You can sign up for free over at consummateathlete.com. Just click on the 7-day healthy kickstart. This podcast is supported by Health IQ, a life insurance company that celebrates the health conscious, including cyclists. Visit healthiq.com/CAPod to learn more and to get a free quote, or check out their life insurance FAQ page to get your questions answered.
The Consummate Athlete podcast is part of the Wide Angle Podium Podcast Network. Check out wideanglepodium.com, listen to the shows, and consider becoming a member.
You can support our show by checking out the shop page at consummateathlete.com for custom and stock training plans, plus all of Molly's books, including Fuel Your Ride and Saddle Sore. And if you have any questions or comments or requests for guests, you can leave them there in our contact form.
Thanks, as always, for tuning in. If you're enjoying the show, it'd be a huge help to us if you subscribe, rate, and review the Consummate Athlete Podcast Show on iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Molly J. Herford and at Peter Glassford, or over on theoutdooredit.com, that's my site, and smartathlete.ca, that's Peter's. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.